Marisa says we can take you off screen while we wait and put you on when they're ready for that, or if that works. Oh.
Hello and welcome to the UK Asexuality Conference's panel on ACE research in the humanities. Today we have 4 scholars who are conducting research into the various aspects of the humanities and its intersection with asexuality studies. The humanities often gets ignored when discussing asexual studies research, but we do have a rich and vibrant series of research that's going on as we speak. So what I'd like to do now is hand the panel over to Martina and let her get us started.
Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Martina. I'm a graduate of the University of Aberdeen. And today I will be talking about the intersection of asexuality research and Renaissance and medieval literature, specifically John Lilly's Sappho and Thea and Geoffrey Chaucer's Troilus and Crusade. Now I shall share my screen if that works. Okay. Okay, you should be able to see my slides, hopefully. Right. So first off, a little bit of a disclaimer. We have, in our modern terminology, we have terms that would not have existed in the medieval and Renaissance times, such as asexual, heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual. Any of these terms are not applicable to pre-modern history. But we're still kind of stuck with using those terms because that's all we have to talk about. But we need to be aware of the fact that they are not how those people would have described themselves. So we need to take them with a grain of salt and not assume that their understanding of sexuality and normative sexuality was the same as it is today. That said, there is a normative sexuality that was understood in the day. Namely, people were assumed, just as they are today, to be sexual by default. And anyone who wasn't sexual by default was considered outside of this norm. And my goal here is to talk about these 2 female characters, Crusade and Sappho, and see how they react to this expectation of compulsory sexuality and what that can tell us about whether or not they might be read as asexual, which I do, again, with the caveat that they would not have described themselves as asexual because the word didn't exist. So Crusade is, in Troilus and Crusade, the setting is the besieged Troy during the Trojan War. Crusade is a widow who's been left alone in the city after her father has fled. Troilus, who is a noble warrior, falls in love with her. Obviously, they haven't even met ever. But this falls under the tradition of courtly love and the expectation that the noble are able to love and be loved in return. So the noble Troilus falls in love with the noble Crusade, and he enlists the help of her uncle Pandarus to court her. This is how Crusade reacts to the news that Troilus is in love with her. She is greatly distressed. Her priorities are with surviving the war, and the news that, oh, this man is in love with you, does not please her. Specifically, something I want to highlight is that she invokes My Lady Pallas. Now, Pallas is the Greek goddess Athena, who is one of the virgin goddesses, to such an extent that one of her most important epithets, Parthenos, means the Virgin Athena. And it's so important that the Parthenon is named after this. So this is a very specific reference that, in my opinion, is very reflective of the fact that she doesn't want this lifestyle of being a sexual being in the sexual economy of the time. Panchas in this context is the representation of compulsory sexuality. He is adamant that no man or woman was ever begotten who wasn't disposed to suffer the heat of love. He is a firm believer in the concept of courtly love. People who are noble in their spirit and their birth, let's be real, are going to be loved and love in return. Crusade is therefore slotted into the role of the courtly beloved. Doesn't want to be this object of love. She wants agency in this, and she doesn't get it. She is coerced and manipulated into returning Troilus' affections. Pandarus threatens a double suicide to get her to return Troilus' affections. And she doesn't manage to withstand this sort of manipulation, and she is forced to comply to compulsory sexuality. However, she does manage one act of resistance. She never bears children for either Troilus or Diomede, who she later betrays Troilus for, in order, again, to keep herself safe in the environment of the war. Her actual desires are completely ignored by everyone around her, but to the reader, they're very, very clearly to be, no, I don't want to be with men. I want to be outside of this economy of sexuality and marriage and subjugation to men, which is basically what marriage is to her. She, however, doesn't manage to resist this. Sappho, on the other side, she is very different from the historical Sappho. I am not ascribing this to the actual Sappho of Lesbos. This Sappho is the Queen of Syracuse, who is unwed, but she is forced to fall in love with Pheo by Venus's intervention, who decides that she needs to fall in love with Pheo and has Cupid shoot her with love arrows. Her reaction, like Crusades, is negative. She doesn't want to be in love with Pheo. Her love manifests as lovesickness, which is a very common trope in medieval and Renaissance literature. But whereas in most cases, the cure to lovesickness is requited love, in her case, it's the absence of love. She doesn't want to sully her honor. She doesn't want to stoop to this need that she now has. And part of that is that they are of vastly different ranks. Sappho is a queen and Pheo is a ferryman. And part of that is that she doesn't want to engage in this compulsory heterosexual love. Like Pandarus in Troilus and Crusade, Venus is here the representation of compulsory sexuality. In her words, she is amiable and therefore must be pierced. She makes use of a lot of violent language. In this other quote here, she says the Venus that which can conquer, and this is presenting her and love by extension as a conquering and violent force which subjugates people, and it's negative in framing. Sappho is transparently very an allegory of Queen Elizabeth I, who had this image of the Virgin Queen. However, Sappho manages to retain this image as far as male suitors are concerned. At the end of the play, she manages to snap out of the spell, and she gains control over Cupid and usurps Venus as goddess of love, and says that she will use love as a tool to be enjoyed by the ladies. So she's either rejecting any sort of eroticism and love, or embracing homoeroticism in her court, which is now entirely homosocial. During the course of the play, her only attendants are women. Both Sappho and Crusade are outside of the daughter-wife dichotomy. Both in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the expected life trajectories for women was to transition from daughters to wives to widows who still had to answer to a son. Crusade is a childless widow, and Sappho is a celibate queen. They are both outside of this dichotomy. They're both outside of this societal prison that they have, which is to be subjugated in one way or another to a man. And this is very queer for the times, because this would have been their societal role, which they managed to escape to a degree. Obviously, Crusade doesn't manage to ward off Troilus, but that's still what she wants to do, what she wants to be. And her desires are still in line with this queer rejection of heterosexuality and compulsory sexuality. They are both under this pressure, and they both wish to escape. However, Sappho manages to escape and either be celibate and queerly virgin, or whereas Crusade doesn't, and she is trapped by these expectations and societal pressures. And that's that for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. I really appreciate your presentation. I forgot to mention at the beginning, if you have any questions, please visit the SliDo link below, and you can ask your questions there, and you can also upvote questions that have already been asked. And then at the end of the session, should we have enough time remaining, we can do a Q&A session. So up next, I'd like to ask Jess if they would be willing to unmute themselves, and we can...
Hi. Yeah, I was muted because I don't know if my laptop fan is going absolutely crazy for everyone else or if it's just for me. But yeah, so so hi, I'm Jess. I've just finished my master's dissertation at the University of York. Literally, as in I submitted it like a week ago, and the deadline hasn't technically passed yet. So today I get to talk all about that, which is really exciting. I have been told by my supervisor that I'm not allowed to like read off the whole thing or really like talk about the whole thing in general. So yeah, I haven't got a fancy PowerPoint this time. So my dissertation is about asexuality and ace-exclusion from queer theory and history. And I looked at this specific theory and queer archival hauntings sort of lens. But the history was the most interesting bit to research. So I'm going to chat a little bit about the theory, but I'll mostly be talking about that. There's some really fascinating ace history out there, stuff that stretches way further back than the beginning of Avon or the internet, which is honestly something that even academics in the field of asexual studies seem to forget quite a lot. So hopefully you will find it as cool as I do. So yeah. The idea that queer theory and literature acts as a kind of archive is one championed by Jose Esteban Munoz, whose many writings on the nature of queer theory sort of says that it acts as a kind of repository of queer lived experience, almost against its own will. And Anne Svetkovich, who advocates for the existence of a physical archive dedicated to the lives of queer people. This existence obviously has its own pros and cons, many of which Munoz addresses in his work. He's constantly fighting back against ideas of what should and should not be included in academic canon, and is a huge advocate for the inclusion of what he calls ephemera, which is evidence of queer lives that is not written down in the strict style of academic publications, so things like music or photos or performance art. And his desire to include ephemera is matched by my own desire to include other queer identities in discussion aside from gay, lesbian, and the occasional trans voices, because these people are often excluded from queer theory and literature, which is why I was writing this thing in the first place. the push to include more in the archive of queer theory is vital, because what is not included will slowly become lost to time as their existence is forgotten. And this has a huge impact on our understanding of queer history and theory. It is not, after all, possible to learn from a text that does not exist, or to give recognition to those involved in an event no one has any evidence of. So imagine, if you will, that there was no evidence, textual, photographic, or otherwise, of the Stonewall riots. How different our understanding of queer activism would be without that cornerstone of history, or how different our perspective of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill would be without any background knowledge of our own Section 28 in the UK. As soon as something is missing from the archive, our understanding of history and theory becomes distorted and confused. And this is what we risk by maintaining the narrow boundaries of what is included in queer academics. So in his book, Cruising Utopia, Munoz states that, quote, "It is important to complicate queer history and understand it as doing more than the flawed process of merely evidencing. Practices of knowledge production are content merely to cull selectively from the past." And this is something that I found to be really true. Queer history is rife with flawed and incomplete narratives, cherry-picked evidence that only tells part of the story. So I spent the past more than several months tracing asexuality as a concept and a term as far back as I can. And what I've discovered is that, far from the popular narrative of asexuality as a 2010s internet identity to make teenage girls on Tumblr feel special, asexuality has existed and been part of the queer community for as long as the queer community as we understand it has existed. So the earliest textual reference to the orientation that we now understand to be asexuality seems to be in Emma Tross's pamphlet, and apologies for the terrible pronunciation, I'm not German, Der Kontrasexualismus in Bezug auf Ehe und Frauenfrage, which campaigns for the rights of lesbians and what she calls Menschen ohne Sinnlichkeit, which translates as people without sensuality. And obviously, as Martina was saying, terminology was very different in different parts of history, and sensuality can be sort of translated onto our understanding of sexuality. Emma Trosser was a teacher and a clinician in 19th century Germany who campaigned for queer rights before such a stance was remotely commonplace, and before the much more famous Magnus Hirschfeld became well known. So in this pamphlet, which was published in 1896, I believe, she argues passionately in favor of the value of Platonic relationships, including queer Platonic relationships, some ace women's sexual repulsion as a reason for them not to marry, and how being without sensuality does not mean that you lack deep emotions or connections with others. In one of her later works, there is a depiction of what I interpret as something akin to the split attraction model, which describes how you can find someone beautiful to look at, but not feel any attraction towards them. I won't lie and say that this aspect of my research was easy. It took the longest time out of anything I've researched, mostly because there isn't an English translation of any of her texts, and my German is not great. But it's definitely something that was worth spending time and effort on, though mostly interesting to me for it being very ace. Her work is applicable to all in the queer community because it includes discussions of same-sex attraction and a description of cross-dressing that has some similarity to how members of the trans community describe their own realization process. While it has largely been forgotten about, which you can tell because there are no translations and it's super hard to find a copy anywhere, her works cover so much ground in regards to queer theory and history that no one would cover again for a long time. She really was someone who was way ahead of her time. Another part of ace history specifically that I personally found fascinating to research was the dichotomy and comparison between the radical feminists who called themselves asexual and ace people as we would recognize them today, but who use slightly different terminology. Because terminology isn't static, it's quite hard sometimes to track down things that match with modern conceptions of a term. So especially when we're talking about sexuality and gender and queerness. And this is a great example of it, because the asexuals of the 70s were less asexual and more celibate, but we don't like that word. So if you did a search for asexuality in the 70s, you would most likely come up with things about Lisa Orlando's Asexual Manifesto, which some people may have heard of, And it outlines the reasons why Orlando and other feminists like her chose to be ace, or more to the point, quote, chose the term asexual to describe ourselves because both celibate and anti-sexual had connotations we wished to avoid. And there is some overlap between Orlando's manifesto and some of the ideas presented in theories such as compulsory sexuality. And I do think that some followers of this manifesto would probably identify as ace today. Orlando considers herself asexual, as far as I'm aware, but it is at its core a political choice, celibacy by another name, rather than asexuality as we understand it. So if you contrast this with Myra Johnson's essay on asexual and autoerotic women, as she terms it, which discusses our oppression specifically within a psychiatric and medical setting as an orientation that is sexually deviant and therefore punished, despite the belief of psychiatrists at the time that we didn't really exist, which makes us both punishable and invisible. And in part because of this invisibility, Johnson takes issue with the use of asexual as a term by radical feminists, and especially with the turn of these feminists towards the sex negative. Such attitudes, according to Johnson, are incredibly damaging to both women generally and ace women. So allosexual women, because it would cause those who continue to have sex to, quote, function as the scapegoat, and ace women because they would become a political symbol, an identity still lost in the slogans and reality going unnoticed. These battles over terminology are really interesting, partially because they still happen today. All you need to do is go on Tumblr to find people getting fired up over whether queer is an acceptable term or not. And partially because of its implications for ace and queer history, because we know the term asexual now. When we search for it in the past, we look for the same term. And that means you're more likely to find asexuality linked to feminism than queer theory, even though we're queer, and that influences how people see us as a sexuality now. And these are not the only instances of queer history that are also ace history, although a fair few of these have had their asexuality erased in favor of making them more queer. So Emma Trosser, just as an example, has been largely forgotten about now. And when she is written about by exactly one German scholar in about 2 articles total, it was with the assumption that she was a lesbian, despite the fact that she wrote in her own pamphlet that she considered herself among those without sensuality. And while asexuality and ace people have always existed, the signs of it are often ignored or co-opted as signs of a more general queerness rather than celebrated as ace specifically. And this is important because ace people, like other members of the queer community, face discrimination and exclusion every day, as I'm sure you all know. Until 2013, asexuality was explicitly pathologized in every medical journal worldwide. In 2013, it was depathologized, but only in the DSM, which is only consistently used in North America. It's still considered an illness in the UK. According to recent statistics, we have the lowest life satisfaction scores, highest rates of mental illness after trans people, and among the most likely to be offered and undergo conversion therapy. On top of this, in most forms of media, there's a woeful lack of ace representation, with the GLAAD Institute's most recent report showing that there has been a grand total of 0 ace recurring characters on primetime TV in the past 3 years. If a character's asexuality is not explicitly stated on screen or in text, they are assumed to either be, or if confirmed to not be straight, some other allosexual flavor of queer. In terms of the queer archive specifically, the illusion of asexuality is really harmful because it means that a lot of generally queer history that includes asexuality has been buried and will eventually be forgotten. So there was a specific example that I used and didn't really bring up where a priest, I think, in America was campaigning for the rights of all people who are LGBT, and because it mentions asexuality, that source has only been rediscovered within the past few years because it wasn't academic canon to include, forgotten about. And it wasn't important enough to the wider queer community to include it. or we will continue to be erased from the queer community based on the fact that there's no historic precedent for us belonging there, even though there definitely is. So including asexuality in queer theory and in archives is something that should not need to be debated. We are queer, therefore we should be included. And yet somehow there has not been a debate for our inclusion, and we are not included. And while times are slowly changing, scholarship pertaining to asexuality as part of the queer community is overwhelmingly by ace people like us here today, trying to prove that we belong, and it's very slow. So what I've endeavored to prove through my research is that we are an integral part of the queer scholarship, especially in the humanities, where we have been largely overlooked. There are so many ways in which asexuality could and should be used within queer theory to broaden our understanding of queerness in general. So my sort of analysis of a lot of historical texts is just a tiny part of what we could be doing. Asexuality provides new angles through which to read texts, new ways to analyze historical records, new interpretations of things we thought we knew for certain. And the queer archive as it stands is incomplete. It's possible that it will never be truly completed. Too much has been lost to time and those who would do us harm. But through including asexuality, it is possible to fill in a few of the empty shelves. So yeah, hopefully one day there will be more ace research in general, especially in the humanities, because researching this was kind of really hard. I'd like to thank the Avon forums for having PDFs for literally everything. It was really useful, because without all of those people trawling the internet and libraries all over the world for these sources, they would probably be lost forever. And yeah, I did write a whole section about online archives and like memes and stuff, which was great fun. But I've been told by my supervisor that I'm not allowed to present my whole dissertation. So we're not going to go into that right now. And if you have any questions, yeah, you can ask them in SliDo or the comments or whatever, because I could ramble about all of this for ages. So yeah, we're done.
Thank you for that, Jess. I really appreciate so that's a really interesting presentation on the history surrounding asexuality. Up next is Nemo Martin. If they're ready, I can put you on the full screen. Oh.
Ooh. Ooh.
Yeah. Hit the wrong button. Sorry.
Thanks. I also have slides, if you don't mind putting them up as well. Thank you. So hello, my name is Nemo Martin. The title of this talk is Never Been a Father, Lover, Husband, Friend, Asexuality as Positivity in Victor Hugo's 1862 novel Les Miserables. A few brief content warnings. There is a graphic description of sex work. It's small but graphic. A discussion of acephobia, references to religious intolerance, incest, and pedophilia. As both Martina and Jess have mentioned, we cannot, of course, ascribe sexualities that did not have explicit definitions in the period, but I will talk in this talk of Jean Valjean's asexuality and aromanticism rather than finding analogous 19th century ones in order to push our concepts of what we can understand to be canonical or period typical in classic literature. On this slide are some photos of Les Mis as portrayed in the 2012 film for anyone who, unlike me, hasn't dedicated their entire life to this novel. So a reminder of who these characters are: Fantine, Anne Hathaway, Valjean, Hugh Jackman, etc., etc. Improper and unregulated heterosexuality that allows the birth of children into systems that cannot support them is, I would argue, the recurring villain of Les Miserables. Fantine's becoming an unwed single mother, the mistreatment of Cosette, Eponine, Azelma, Gavroche, and their unnamed siblings under the Thénardiers, Marius Pontmercy's being kept from his father, even the nearly doomed relationship between Cosette and Marius. Each character is tainted by an inability to function in the dysfunctional cis heterosexual world. Welcomed into these situations is the interference of the childless protagonist, Jean Valjean, whose freedom to navigate the world comes, in part, from his lack of a personal entanglement with cis heteronormativity. On this slide is an engraving of Jean Valjean with the ace flag with some quotes around it and the bear flag hidden behind it. Hugo tells us that Valjean has never experienced romantic or sexual attraction to another human, opting to live a solitary life. Hugo states that Jean Valjean had never loved anything and that his heart was virginal in so many ways. He was also he had also never really thought about what the beauty of a woman was. The closest he comes to love is his feelings for his daughter, Cosette, which Hugo clarifies are platonic despite his reverence. In the 21st century, we might read this queer sexuality as one of several options. On this slide, there are 3 engravings, one of some people in prison, one of a bishop with candlesticks, and one of Jean Valjean standing in a trench coat in a room. First, Jean Valjean's lack of sexual interest may be an involuntary celibacy due to his life, leaving little time nor opportunity for. As Hugo states, Valjean's youth was spent in hard and badly paid labor. He had never been known to have a sweetheart in the region. He had never had the time to fall in love. Valjean was then taken from this adolescence and placed in prison, growing into non-sexual maturity while in Toulon. The argument could thus be made that this incarceration prevented any heterosexual education. A second interpretation may be Valjean's voluntary celibacy on account of his devotion to doing God's work to pay back the bishop who bought his soul. As Grossman argues, millennia of religious prescriptions and the enforced chastity of penned monks and the sexless marriage of nuns to a dead Christ have colored how we view asexuality as being a significantly religious one. Whether consciously or not, the town trusts in Valjean's lack of allosexuality because it is, in some ways, an indication of his not placing any individual, including himself, over and above the community. The townspeople note that nobody comes or goes to his rooms, and so imagine them as an anchorite cell, projecting saintliness onto his solitude. A quick note to say that this is not to argue that asexuality and aromanticism are themselves indicators of an absence of selfishness, but that in Jean Valjean, these aspects are speculated on by his community and then absorbed into their consideration of him. His lack of sexual desire is deemed to be a positive attribute in his community. Unusual, perhaps, but not one seen as abhorrent or a quality to be fixed. In a third reading, we might see Valjean as being aromantic and asexual, terms used to describe a lack of sexual and romantic desire. The importance of this reading would be to go against the dominant societal presupposition that experienced sexual and romantic desire is a non-contestable fact of humanity, as is protested in Milks and Sarankovsky's collection on asexuality. While there is some use to differentiating between these readings, in an unpublished paper, Yoon-Jung Kim argues that, quote, the attempt to differentiate asexuality from other political and cultural practices such as celibacy, as well as from biological dysfunction such as impotence or the inability to experience orgasm, reduces asexuality to a single entity and simplifies sexuality, thereby reinforcing the explanatory power of medical discourse over an individual's diverse experiences. While religious chastity, impotence, and asexuality are not exact synonyms, Kim urges us to remember that for some individuals, these identities may be hard to disentangle, or indeed that doing so is unwanted. For instance, in his work on the representation of impotence in queer literature, Andrew K. Kaufman urges us to consider all dimensions of the reality of impotence, not just when it is portrayed as an isolated taboo. One Les Miserables fanfiction, which sees a relationship between Jean Valjean and Javert, for example, considers the topic of age-related erectile dysfunction, differentiating pleasure and intimacy from the ability to maintain an erection, especially in a couple with a previous lack of experience in romantic and sexual relationships. Valjean in this reading can therefore be a person who can/does not experience sexual arousal or romantic attachment, while also choosing to remain celibate as part of his religious practice. Doing a specifically asexual reading for Valjean is, however, important because of the common, quote, discourses that make asexuality more or less implausible and uninhabited for men. In one study, asexual male participants told Ella Prisbillo that being a man, being sexual, and being straight are closely aligned and allied with each other. Julian Oldham states that classic ways we can read asexuality in the concepts of female frigidity or virginity. And I would argue that Valjean's asexuality has yet to be considered despite the same language used of him, because these terms are historically deemed to be female qualities. There has perhaps been an attempt in the upkeep of Valjean's legacy to minimize these terms of asexuality, both in adaptation and in critical scholarship, to protect Valjean's masculinity, believed to be rooted in his unmannish lack of sexuality. I now turn to the BBC's 2019 adaptation of Les Miserables, written by Andrew Davies. In interviews, Davies continually raised the relationship between Jean Valjean and antagonist Javert as an issue to be, quote, dealt with in adapting the novel. Quote, Valjean and Javert both seem to be virgins, which is so extraordinary. You know, two mature men, and we don't have any account of either of them having a loving relationship or a sexual relationship. Maybe sex is unimportant to Javert. And then, having met Jean Valjean, he gets so annoyed of him that this develops into a kind of obsession, which is like a twisted love affair. I did toy with the idea of letting Javert have loveless sex with a 50-year-old prostitute just as a matter of cleaning their pipes out, end quote. Davies' phrasing here is especially key. He talks of letting Javert have heterosexual sex to free himself from the sexless identity that Hugo has created for him. By allowing Javert to clean out his pipes with a woman who is, in this 82-year-old screenwriter's opinion, past her prime, Davies holds a position of power in which he considers himself kind by allying Javert closer to heterosexuality. Jean Valjean's similar sexuality within the show is brushed away with less explicit homophobia than Javert's is, but Davies cannot help but enforce cis heterosexuality on Jean Valjean's character, likely so that Javert's perversion cannot be read as being a consensual relationship. On screen are two screenshots from the BBC Les Mis show. One shows some curtains with two women behind it. One woman is getting changed, and the other shows Jean Valjean sitting, looking through the gap in the curtains. On the right are some of the shooting script, extracts of the shooting script. This enforced heterosexuality goes to its extreme in the show when Valjean's adopted daughter Cosette reaches adulthood. When she desires a new wardrobe, Jean Valjean joins her to get outfitted. As we experience a montage in which the joyful girl Cosette is made into a woman with increasingly more revealing outfits, we see shot-reverse shots of Jean Valjean slumped in his seat. The dressmaker thus catches Valjean when he looks up, purposefully intending on sneaking a peek through the curtains at Cosette mid-undress. Davies tells us in the script that he looks away hastily. Jean Valjean's faced. He's got problems. Davies implies here that Valjean holds sexual desire towards his underage daughter. In doing so, Davies argues that incestual and pedophilic desire are sexualities that are worth giving space to be explored by his protagonist because they are still, at the end of the day, straight and sexual. It can be assumed that should Cosette have been a young man, Davies would not have given any thought to including a delightful undressing montage in which Valjean could sneak a peek at his underage son, whether Valjean has got problems or not. The scene alone speaks to how Davies and a wider society see the sexualization of a young girl in a protagonist as the more, quote, normal sexuality, far more believable than a man who would not desire his own daughter. Davies purposefully reaffirms white masculinity rather than depict Jean Valjean to be asexual. I would argue that this is because Davies did not see Valjean nor Javert's similar asexuality as being a positive trait, emphasizing instead a perverse allosexuality. In his work on queer readings of 19th century literature, Graham Robb observes that when an academic reads expressions of heterosexual desire, they're doing literary criticism that demonstrates the work's universal relevance. But when reading text as expressions of queerness, they are accused of engaging in appropriation and conscripting a writer for the cause. While Hugo is by no means perfect, nor do I believe that he was writing Jean Valjean and Javert as explicitly asexual characters. What can we call the BBC adaptation's enforced hetero-allosexuality, if not an anachronistic and anti-canonical attempt to appropriate a protagonist for the heteronormative sexual cause? I argue thus that in purposefully and flagrantly naming Hugo's characters as sitting within the asexual aromantic umbrella, we will begin to see these queer identities not as anachronistic misappropriations, but of universal relevance to literary criticism and beyond. Thank you. And please screenshot the bibliography if you need it.
All right. Thank you, Nemo. That was very interesting. Up next is our final presenter, Rebecca. If you would unmute, and we can add your slides to the stream.
Lovely. I'm hoping I'll be able to stay because I seem to be having some internet connections, but we'll give it our best shot. So I'm Rebecca Humphreys-Umford, and I'm a master's student at the University of Birmingham. And my research focuses on representations of asexuality on British television, where I'm attempting to retrace a history of how asexuality has been represented on screen. Today, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the history and representations of self-identified fictional ace characters. So this is characters who use asexual terminology on screen. And this will be through the characters of Connor from a 2014 episode of the BBC soap Doctors, Liv, who has appeared on the ITV soap Emmerdale from 2016 to present, and Florence and Steve from the second and third series of Netflix's drama Sex Education from 2020 onwards. So I'm first just going to give a brief overview of what happens in each example, and then discuss some of the positives and negatives of each. Now, as you may imagine, these representations aren't ideal, so I just want to give a bit of a content warning for discussions of aphobia throughout, and a mention of dubious consent in regard to sex in my discussion about Doctors, which is where I'm going to start. So here we look back to 2014, when a single episode of Doctors, a daytime soap set in a doctor's surgery, explored asexuality, and this is the earliest fictional example to use asexual terminology on screen in reference to what we'd now understand as asexuality on British television. So this episode is concerned with Connor, who is a white cisgender man who doesn't want to have sex with his girlfriend on his 16th birthday after they had agreed to wait until then to have sex. Because of this, Connor's mum just thinks he's gay, and his cousin Kev, a doctor, thinks he's just putting pressure on himself. Now, Connor and his girlfriend do end up having sex after she convinces him that sex will be the best birthday present he could get, and that it would make her his real girlfriend. But it doesn't go very well. In the end, Connor's mum announces to everyone at his birthday party that he is gay, and Kev, the doctor, then speaks to him, asking if everything works down there, before finally suggesting that Connor may actually be asexual, when Connor admits that he'd rather his girlfriend didn't care about sex rather than enjoy having sex with her. Now here, asexuality is defined as people who have no desire for sex at all, and Connor is comforted that he's not alone in feeling this way. However, when they explain this to Connor's mum, she doesn't believe that asexuality is real, asking if it can be treated and bemoaning the fact that she won't get grandkids. Nonetheless, Connor and his girlfriend seemingly get a happy ending, with her saying that they love each other and that she won't give up on him, but only after Connor agrees that he wants sex between them to be great. So, on the whole, this obviously isn't a great representation of asexuality, but everything has to start somewhere, I guess, and this nonetheless allows an insight into how asexual representations have started to change over time. However, starting representations with the asexual character being manipulated into having sex, questions of conversion therapy and medical confusion surrounding the existence of asexuality does set a very low standard. Indeed, I think one of the few good things what comes from this representation is the fact that the doctor, in the end, advocates for the legitimacy of asexuality and argues against the acephobia expressed by Connor's mum. When just 2 years beforehand on the American TV series House MD used its one asexual episode to pathologise asexuality, with the two asexual characters cured by the end of the episode, this is at least an improvement, albeit a small one. Then, 2 years later, in 2016, Liv, a white cisgender teenage woman, was introduced on Emmerdale. And this is the first recurring asexual character on British television, and also likely the longest running asexual representation anywhere on television. I could be wrong, but I find it odd that there's practically no mention of the character in discussions about asexual representations because of this. Now, Liv has starred in hundreds of episodes, so I'm just going to highlight a few key moments surrounding asexuality, and these moments were apparent from her outset in 2016, with Liv admitting that she didn't like a boy like that, and later admitting that she didn't understand the hassle of sex and relationships. The next few years dealt with Liv's confusion of not liking anyone at all, and her coming out to friends and family about her questioning her asexuality. In 2019, she started dating a boy, admitting that she liked him and wanted to try being more than friends, but explaining that she didn't want to have sex, not because she hadn't met the right person or that she hadn't blossomed into a woman, but because she just doesn't want to, and that's not who she is. And I think, very importantly, she was accepted for this. I also think it's important that Liv herself didn't have to suffer through her asexuality being questioned by others, but was rather able to dispel these assumptions herself. Liv later explained to her brother/guardian, who was confused about Liv's relationship, that she had done her research, that she's not the only person to not have sexual feelings for people, and explained that she still has romantic feelings, but isn't attracted to people physically. And again, her asexuality was accepted without question. And indeed, Liv and her brother were able to bond over their experiences of coming out, with her brother being gay. Now, Liv's relationship didn't last, but she officially came out as asexual a year later in 2020 and started dating Vinny. Now, the pair soon moved in together, but Liv's asexuality and Vinny's acceptance of her asexuality always remained an important topic, be it when they discussed officially becoming boyfriend and girlfriend, or they agreed to share a bed non-sexually after they admitted that they loved each other. And I think Emmerdale has done well in creating a non-sexual but loving, romantic and intimate relationship between them. However, Emmerdale is of course a soap, and no soap character seems to be allowed to be happy for very long, and as such, Liv and Vinny's relationship broke down in 2021. Now, asexuality did feature in the 2021 Pride episode, with asexual flags hanging in the village's cafe for anyone who recognised them. Probably not many people, but still. But Liv was struggling with ongoing issues with alcoholism at this point, and therefore she played a very little role in the episode, which narratively made sense, but still sadly neglected asexuality's place in the queer community. Now, in the next year, this year, 2022, she rekindled her relationship with Vinny, where they kissed for the first time on the screen, and the pair have recently gotten married, which is another first for an asexual character on British TV. So overall, asexuality in Emmerdale has been treated with respect, and I'd probably say it's one of the best representations of asexuality currently available to us. Now, of course, not everything is as great as I've described. There are asephobic comments, although Liv is often able to dispel these. And the genre of soap does unfortunately mean that she can't just be an asexual character, she has to suffer as an asexual character, sadly like all soap characters. But at the end of the day, Liv's recurring role across various storylines over the years has allowed an ongoing exploration of her asexuality, as well as exploring Liv as a 3D character who has friends, family, a husband, jobs, hobbies and addiction, and medical problems, which is pretty much more than can be said for any other representation of asexuality so far. So Liv officially came out in 2020, and in the same year, Florence, a teenage cisgender white woman, was introduced in the second series of Sex Education. Now, this is one of the best known representations of asexuality, watched by millions of people worldwide, and often heralded as one of the best representations of asexuality there is. However, Florence gets just 6 minutes of screen time, and between her auditioning and rehearsing for the school play, where she feels singled out by other students for not understanding the hypersexualized nature of the play or wanting to have sex, Florence seeks out Otis, another student who has been giving out sex advice. Florence airs her concerns of not wanting to have sex, but feeling like she should, just so she isn't made to feel like a freak, but is simply told, when you meet the right person, I'm sure you'll be ready. Thankfully, Florence also speaks to Dr. Jean Milburn, a sex relationships therapist who has been working at her school. And when Florence explains that she never wants to have sex with anyone ever and that she has no connection to sex, Florence, Doctor simply asks her, "Do you know what asexuality is?" And explains that it's when someone has no sexual attraction to any sex or gender. Sex just doesn't do it for some people. Some asexual people still want romantic relationships, but they don't want the sex bit, and others don't want either. Sex doesn't make us whole, and so how could you ever be broken? Which is great validation, right? But other than later appearing in the school show, that's the entirety of Florence's and therefore asexuality's inclusion. Of course, this is great visibility, allowing millions of people to understand the legitimacy of asexuality. But as the ace couple comment on their podcast, Florence's inclusion tokenizes asexuality, and Florence is no more than a 2D character. When every other topic relating to sex or sexuality on the show has warranted a more thorough exploration, then it's clear that asexuality is seemingly at the bottom of a hierarchy and has neglected the exploration it deserves. And given that the premise of the show involves Otis giving sex advice to fix everyone's sexual problems, it almost feels as though asexuality's inclusion was almost a disclaimer, as if to say that they recognise that not all sexual problems can be fixed, but that most can. Not that asexuality is, of course, a problem or something that needs to be fixed. And furthermore, the third series of sex education, which completely forgot about Florence, allowed another student, Steve, a cisgender white man who has appeared since the first series, to come out as demisexual, but only in a couple of blink and you miss it moments where he wears a sign saying, "I think I'm demisexual." Now, this is another first for representations of asexuality, but demisexuality is never defined on screen, and whether or not this will be explored in the next series is unknown, which could yet again leave asexual identities to be forgotten. So, where does that leave us? I don't think it's particularly groundbreaking to say that fictional asexuality on British TV has been represented as an exclusively young, white, cisgender, heteronormative, alloromantic, and sex-neutral identity, with narratives focused solely on coming out in an attempt to make asexuality palatable enough for audiences. And I'm sure a lot of us are already aware of how far asexual representations are lacking. But nonetheless, these representations are important. They contribute to our history, and these representations inform or often misinform audiences about asexuality, with each example being watched by over 1 million people. Of course, there is nothing inherently wrong in representing asexuality in this way, and as Angela Chen, author of Ace, says, there is no one asexual or ace story that can capture all of ace experience. But when every story focuses on the same asexual experiences, it becomes a problem. We need more representations, and we need a diversity of representations. Is it any wonder that a 2019 Sky News poll revealed that 75% of respondents were wrong in defining asexuality?
I think we may have lost Rebecca there. Okay. All right. Well, until Rebecca returns, if she manages to come back in the next few minutes, maybe she can wrap up her presentation. But in the meantime, you've been asking questions. The audience has been asking questions on SliDo and voting on the ones that they want to hear. We don't have enough time to do all of them, obviously. We only have about 5 or 6 minutes left. So that's enough time to answer a few questions. So why don't we go ahead and Rebecca's back. Hi, Rebecca. Do you want to finish up your presentation?
I guess I should. I'm not quite sure where exactly you heard me up to.
I think you were on the conclusion slide and talking about how asexuality on British television appears to be young, white, talking about the stereotypes surrounding it.
Okay, I'm just going to spiel off my conclusion quickly and then we can move on. I won't bother with the slides, but where shall we go through? I'm just going to say we need more representations and we need a diversity of representations. Is it any wonder that a 2019 Sky News poll revealed that 75% of respondents were wrong in defining asexuality, or did that not know that asexual people do experience a sex drive, when asexuality has repeatedly been misrepresented and depicted as a monolithic entity rather than a wide-reaching range of experiences? I don't want to be all doom and gloom. Representations aren't where we need them to be, but they are thankfully starting to change over time. Asexuality is no longer solely defined by not desiring sex, as it is in doctors, but rather moving towards being defined by not experiencing sexual attraction, which is perhaps more representative of asexuality as a whole, but still not inclusive of us all. Sex education validated the existence of asexuality immediately, without the doctor first questioning if it was a medical problem. And Liv's asexuality was accepted by her family and her village, whereas Connor's mum was acephobic. And these are all improvements, but again, only within a white, cis, heteronormative and alloromantic framework. However, on British TV in general, moving away from fictional representations, asexuality is gaining more visibility than ever, with asexuals being treated with respect rather than sensationalism, and with asexual experiences diversified beyond young, white, heteronormative and alloromantic possibilities. Asexual representations on British TV do exist, and they are starting to change. So whilst the history of fictional representations of asexuality on British TV may not have always been in our favour, there is at least hope for the future. I'm Rebecca, and thanks for listening.
All right, everyone. So we are very close to the time allotted, to exceeding the time allotted for this panel. So what we're going to do is, instead of doing the SliDo questions here, if anyone has any questions, please visit the Discord text chat, and we can continue the discussion there. I want to personally thank all of our panelists. They did a wonderful job. So, this would be the time where we'd all give them a great round of applause. Please feel free to follow up with them to see, how their work is progressing. And I really am excited about, seeing their works published in the future. All right, so thank you all for coming, and have a nice rest of your conference.